On the morning of October 22, 1907, a rumour reached New York that a bank called Knickerbocker Trust was in trouble. Within 3 hours, 1,000 people were standing on Fifth Avenue outside its offices, each one waiting to pull their money out. The bank ran out of cash before noon and closed its doors. What happened next was not localized. Panic spread bank to bank, city to city, in the way panics do when there is nothing to stop them. Businesses that had never heard of Knickerbocker Trust suddenly could not borrow money to make payroll. The credit system of the United States was seizing up. The United States had no central bank, no lender of last resort, no single institution with the reserves or the authority to step in. What it had, in that particular week, was a 70-year-old private banker named J.P. Morgan. Morgan summoned the presidents of every major New York bank to his private library on East 36th Street. He locked the door. No one was leaving until each man had pledged enough money to stop the run. By 3 in the morning, they had pledged $25 million. The panic broke. Morgan was 70. He would be dead in 6 years. The country had just been saved from financial collapse by one man's will, one locked door, and one very long night. That was not a system. That was luck. And before it ran out, someone would have to build something better. The tools for something better already existed. The Bank of England had been acting as lender of last resort since 1844. The German Reichsbank could inject emergency liquidity within hours. Central banking was not a theory. It was a working machine that most of the world was already running. America had tried it twice. Alexander Hamilton built the first Bank of the United States in 1791. Andrew Jackson killed it, calling it a monster of concentrated power. Congress created a second bank. Jackson killed that too. From 1836 to 1913, 77 years, the United States ran without a central bank and experienced financial panics in 1873, 1893, and now 1907. The resistance was not irrational. A central bank in the wrong hands could tighten credit on farms and loosen it on trading floors. The concern was real. It had simply never been weighed against the cost of having nothing. After 1907, Congress created the National Monetary Commission and gave it a task: find out how European banking worked and determine what America should do. The chairman was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the Senate's most visible banking ally, and the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Aldrich spent 2 years in Europe, visiting central banks and reading balance sheets. By 1910, the engineering problem was solved. The political problem, how to introduce a European institution into a country that had spent a century rejecting the concept, was the one nobody had cracked yet. In 1902, a German-born banker named Paul Warburg arrived in New York. He had studied the Bank of England in London and joined Kuhn, Loeb and Company on Wall Street. Almost immediately he began writing pamphlets, articles, speeches, arguing that the American banking system was structurally incapable of surviving a serious crisis. His diagnosis was specific. American banks held reserves separately across thousands of independent institutions. In a crisis, each bank hoarded its own reserves to survive, which made the overall shortage worse. European banks pooled reserves behind a central institution, which could lend freely from the common pool. The pooled reserve was the mechanism. Without it, panics were inevitable. Warburg had explained this clearly for 8 years. Nobody had acted. After 1907, Aldrich read his pamphlets carefully. The two men met and agreed on the engineering. They also agreed on the politics. Any plan seen to originate from Wall Street would be voted down before Congress finished reading it. If the design was to survive, it could not be seen being designed. The solution was to hide the meeting entirely. 6 men, a private rail car, a destination nobody would connect to financial legislation. They would use only first names. They would tell anyone who asked that they were going duck hunting on an island off the coast of Georgia. They were going to Jekyll Island. Jekyll Island, in November 1910, was the private winter retreat of America's wealthiest families, the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. The club charged $125,000 to join. 7 miles of Barrier Island off the Georgia coast, accessible only by boat, with no journalists and no public. The 6 men who boarded a private railcar at Hoboken Station on the night of November 22, 1910, were Senator Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew of the Treasury, Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan, Charles Norton of First National Bank, Frank Vanderbilts of National City Bank, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb. First names only, no luggage bearing real names. Vanderbilts wrote about it 25 years later. I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our hard labour would be lost. 6 men representing roughly a quarter of the world's available credit, travelling in disguise. They worked for 9 days. The product, the Aldrich Plan, proposed a National Reserve Association, a central institution backed by member banks, capable of issuing new currency against pooled reserves. The European mechanism, translated for America, with the word bank removed entirely. A bank in Oklahoma hit by sudden credit demand could borrow from the association, posting its own commercial loans as collateral. The association issued new currency. The money supply expanded to meet the demand and contracted when loans were repaid. No panic. No one locked in a library. In 1912, Nelson Aldrich presented his plan to Congress. It was killed before it could be properly debated. Not because the mechanism was wrong. Most experts who read it agreed the engineering was sound. But Aldrich's name was on the cover, the Senate's most visible banking ally, whose daughter had married a Rockefeller. A plan bearing his name carried its verdict before anyone opened it. Then Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 presidential election. The Democrats swept Congress. Aldrich retired. The plan appeared to be finished. 2 men in Wilson's party read it anyway. Carter Glass of Virginia, who would chair the House Banking Committee, and Robert Owen of Oklahoma, who would chair the Senate Banking Committee, understood that the mechanism was correct regardless of who had written it. They did not throw it away. They performed surgery on it. 3 things changed. Private control became public oversight. A Federal Reserve Board appointed by the President, not elected by member banks. The single national institution became 12 regional reserve banks, so no city could dominate. And the name became the Federal Reserve. The mechanism, pooled reserves, elastic currency, a lender of last resort, remained almost exactly as Warburg had designed it on Jekyll Island. What changed was the wrapper, and the wrapper was enough to pass. The Federal Reserve Act was signed by Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913. To understand what was actually created, start with the problem it solved. Before the Fed, American banks held reserves separately. Every autumn, when farmers needed credit for the harvest, demand for cash spiked simultaneously across hundreds of banks. There was no mechanism to meet it. Interest rates lurched, credit seized. It happened every year, like clockwork. Here is the simplified version. Every member bank deposited a fraction of its reserves with its regional Federal Reserve Bank, creating a pool. If a bank in Kansas needed more cash, it brought short-term commercial loans to the Fed and borrowed against them. The Fed issued new Federal Reserve notes to fund the loan. The money supply expanded when the economy needed it, contracted when loans came back. The Fed also set the price of that borrowing, the discount rate. High rate, credit expensive, spending slows. Low rate, money cheap, economy grows. One number, adjusted by a board in Washington, altered the cost of every loan in the country. Every mortgage rate ever quoted, every decision about whether to invest or wait, every government bond ever issued, all sit inside the gravitational field of that rate. Raise it 2 points, and millions of people cannot afford the house they plan to buy. The 6 men on Jekyll Island designed the architecture. Pooled reserves, elastic currency, one institution with the authority to lend in a crisis. The century of doctrine that followed was built on that frame. The frame has not been structurally replaced. For 22 years, the Jekyll Island meeting officially did not happen. Aldrich never mentioned it. Warburg never mentioned it. The official account gave credit to Glass, Owen, and Wilson, and said nothing about 9 days on a private island in Georgia. In February 1935, Frank Vanderbilts published a long article in the Saturday Evening Post. He was 70, retired, and no longer worried. He named every man on the train, described the first names only rule, and explained the cover story. "Discovery," he wrote, "simply must not happen, or else all our hard labor would be lost." The disclosure produced no crisis. The revelation that the Fed's design had been drafted in secret landed as historical curiosity. Interesting, not obviously sinister. The Federal Reserve had been running for 22 years and had survived a world war. People trusted it well enough. Then, in 1994, a libertarian author named G. Edward Griffin published The Creature from Jekyll Island, which argued the Fed was a conspiracy to enslave the American people through debt. It sold millions of copies. It is still in print. It became the dominant popular framing, and it crowded out the part that made the history genuinely complicated. The Aldrich plan failed. The document drafted on Jekyll Island was rejected by Congress. The Federal Reserve was designed by Democrats, structured around public accountability, and named to avoid any appearance of banker control. The bankers got the mechanism. They did not get the institution. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Here is what the 1910 Jekyll Island meeting actually was. 6 men gathered to solve a real engineering problem: how to build a lender of last resort for a country that had spent 77 years refusing to have one, under conditions of secrecy the problem itself required. The tools existed. The political environment made it impossible to use them in public. The secrecy was not malice. Paul Warburg had been making the correct argument in plain published language for 8 years. Nobody had acted. The duck hunt was an acknowledgement that the right answer, presented correctly, would still be rejected. So they hid the arrival. What they produced was sound enough to outlast them. The Democrats who defeated Aldrich used the same design. Every central bank in the world now runs on the same principle: pooled reserves, elastic currency, one institution with the authority to lend in a crisis. In 1907, a panic was stopped by one man locking people in his library. In 2008, the Federal Reserve extended more than $2 trillion in emergency lending in a single week, preventing the collapse of the global banking system while most people slept. The machine ran because 6 men had worked out the blueprint 98 years earlier. The uncomfortable question is not whether the meeting was secret. It was. The question is whether the thing they built was right, whether anyone should have that power over the price of money. They designed it well. Whether the right people were ever in the room is a question that, in more than 100 years, has still not been answered.